1 minute till blast.
Begin the warning siren.
Welcome to the world's largest limestone quarry. A man-made Grand Canyon just over 4 miles long and more than 150 feet deep.
5, 4,
A chasm that has been
3,
widening every year.
2, fire in the hole.
For the last 100 years. The pioneers who came to this region more than a century ago, the northeast corner of Michigan's Lower Peninsula, were mostly lumbermen. Sawmills. You could walk across a body of water and never get your feet wet. But by the late 1800s, that industry had fallen on hard times.
Trees were declining. They'd have to go further and further out. In fact, by that time, most of the Lower Peninsula was pretty much stripped bare of all trees that could be harvested. The industry that was supposedly long-lasting is dying.
Limestone would soon beckon a new kind of pioneer, the industrialist in the wilderness. Men like Carl David Bradley, without whom the quarry might never have happened at all. The early pioneers were intrigued by limestone, but had first come for the lumber.
Prior to 1900, interest in the limestone became something that was worth exploring. Who actually started considering it for a building material was probably Francis Crawford, the one who started what became known as Crawford's Quarry.
A self-made real estate developer, Francis Crawford bought 5,000 acres along Lake Huron and arrived with his family in 1864. Like many others, he came to harvest timber, but he kept a close eye on the valuable white rock showing through his underbrush, limestone. Eventually, he named his land Crawford's Quarry, thinking the mineral might be suitable for building stones. He was wrong. "8,000 acres of pale white rock, and not 1 inch suitable for what Crawford had in mind. Yet for all of its uses, from the steel in your car and the cement on our roads, to the antacid you take after a heavy meal, limestone just might as well be gold."
There's so many uses for that material that most of the people that even worked there over the years and retired don't have any idea what it's all used for.
A lot of people think it was only used by the steel industry. Nowadays, there's other uses for the stone that's here.
It's used as a coloring agent, Rubbermaid plastics.
Desulfurization of exhaust gases from coal-fired power plants.
It's used in the making of chemical and cleaning products.
The glass industry.
Roofing materials.
Your windshield on your cars.
Sugar. Your table sugar.
It's used in the making of acetylene gas, which is used for cutting torch.
Milk of magnesia. So there isn't too many things that you touch every day that limestone isn't involved in.
Limestone owes its existence to billions of sea creatures and coral beds that once thrived in an ancient primordial sea.
350 million years ago, we were actually at the bottom of a shallow saltwater tropical sea. The limestone was actually created by millions and millions of these creatures that had a limey exoskeleton, this calcium carbonate exoskeleton, living and dying and falling to the bottom of the ocean. This went on for millions and millions of years, and that's what created these wonderful limestone deposits, these animals living and dying and falling to the bottom of those lagoons. And that's what created the fossils that we see today.
By the end of the 19th century, the Crawford family had sold off the land and moved away. A local newspaperman, Frederick Denny Lark, proclaimed in 1884, "What a bonanza there should be to manufacture it here, where the stone is at the water's edge, fuel cheap, and dockage a mere nominal expense. Here is a fortune for someone." Lark's words would eventually be heeded 23 years later. Meanwhile, schoolteacher William R. Scott was asked to send a few limestone samples to a lab in Marine City. He crated up about 200 pounds and hired a stagecoach to drive them to a nearby train station. Months later, Arscott discovered that his shipment had never left the station. The station master, thinking the heavy rock-filled boxes had just been a practical joke, had refused to send them. As the new century dawned, Frederick Denny Lark continued to laud the idea of developing a limestone business.
Lark used his newspaper as a pulpit. If there was something he wanted to encourage in a town, he made sure his newspaper was the instrument through which he made that known. And he would name names.
He wrote about Henry H. Hinshaw, a geologist working for a company that produced soda ash. But the company soon lost interest in the limestone and moved out. Henry Hinshaw remained.
The development of the quarry as a place to process limestone, that was a totally different set of capitalists.
Industrialists William F. White, Paul Heft, and Henry Hinshaw, along with 3 other New York investors, formed the Michigan Limestone and Chemical Company in May of 1910. In just 2 years, they would open for business.
The quarry itself probably was a mud hole.
No railroad line came near the quarry, so they built a 14-mile spur in 1911.
That was about 14 miles of swamp, trees, and legal battles before they got to calcite.
Immigrants poured into the region to join the lumbermen who also needed to find work in the new quarry.
Well, you had mostly immigrants from the German provinces. So a lot of people would have come from Westphalia, Prussia, West Prussia, Brandenburg. Those are all provinces of the German-speaking nation. You had some of the Polish. The immigrants were, for the most part, what we would call peasants in Europe. They were people who wanted their own farmland, their land. They could own it.
An article in the local paper described the scene. From an atmosphere of sepulchral quietness, we were suddenly ushered into a bedlam of methodical noises. The sound of hammer and saw, the puff of the locomotive, the crunching of the steam shovel as it rooted its iron snout into the limestone, told plainer words that Rogers City, at last, had come unto its own. But the noise of the industry masked a grim reality. Michigan Limestone and Chemical was running short of money. William White needed a man who could finish the job. His name would become synonymous with triumph and tragedy. Carl David Bradley. A native of Chicago, born September 12, 1860, Bradley began his career as an iron founder. He soon became known as a natural, charismatic leader. In the 1890s, Bradley moved to New York, where he met brothers James and William White. James ran a successful engineering firm, William an investing company. Bradley was in good company. But 15 years later, William's Northern Michigan quarry threatened to become a financial ruin even before it opened. In 1911, confident that he had the right man for the job, he sent Carl Bradley to Rogers City.
White hired him to manage construction of the plant and get it going. They had been constructing since 1910, and now we're going into 1912, and there's still no production of stone. He wants, in effect, to light a fire under this thing and get it moving. So Bradley was hired as that manager.
They were carving a major industrial plant out of a rugged wilderness. They had to bring everything, including their own power, their own coal, their own boilers for the generators, all of it brought by rail to the site. Bradley was undaunted.
And I understand he did a very good job. He had a way about him that had brought out the best in people. Eventually, in 1912, he moved permanently to Rogers City. The first limestone that was actually extracted was a wall a couple hundred feet from the water. The drillers would come in on top of that wall, drill holes, put a powder charge or some kind of explosive charge down the hole, touch it off,
they did it. On a memorable Sunday afternoon, June 23, 1912, residents from nearby towns boarded a passenger coach christened the Rogers City and Calcite Limited to get an eyeful of their brand new quarry. The ride was free. As local papers gushed about the inexhaustible bluff of superior limestone and the mysterious laboratory of nature, the real work down in the quarry began. From the crusher, to the screening house, to the first load filling the steamship Manola, and the calcite, a new kind of ship called a self-unloader which did just that. Limestone was delivered to customers everywhere, courtesy of a vast inland sea known as the Great Lakes.
So Bradley was the one who, for the next 15 years, sought to find markets for the stone, build whatever he needed to get the plant operating efficiently and up to capacity. This is what he knew he could do. This is what he was going to do.
July 28, 1914, World War I begins. But the United States would not enter the conflict until April of 1917. America's industry, however, was involved almost from the beginning.
From 1914 on, the steel industry in the United States was doing marvelously well because they were producing steel to make ships. So where does the quarry fit in? The quarry is producing limestone for these steel mills. And then when the U.S. entered the war, the government took over the control and management of the steel companies so that they were producing steel for American naval ships.
In 1920, calcite entered a new phase as United States Steel purchased all quarry operations, including the fleet. Bradley, White, and a handful of the executives remained with the company.
Then we move into what's known as the Roaring '20s. There was still a tremendous output of limestone, and there was still the steel-making industries.
By the late 20s, two freighters shared their name with the man who had made it possible. The second Carl D. Bradley, christened July 27, 1927, would stand as the flagship of the Bradley fleet for 30 years. But hardly a year later, on March 19, 1928, Carl David Bradley, the man, passed away suddenly in Pasadena, California. He was 68.
And when he died, it was like one of those places today where the flags went down to half-mast and you could have black drapes and crepe all over the town, because when he died, it was like the heart of the town died with him.
He had built a community around his beloved calcite plant. Neighborhoods, vegetable gardens, a gazebo, schools, churches, baseball teams.
We weren't a Chicago or a Gary. We weren't a Cleveland. We weren't a Detroit. We weren't someplace where the steel mills were. We weren't where the iron ores are. We were just one little industry.
In a day when the words company town invoked a better meaning, Bradley's hometown version of a community and its local industry was by all accounts born from a genuine affection for the people who lived and worked in Rogers City. The Great Depression. As it did with the rest of the country, the crash of 1929 hit calcite hard.
Tonnage dropped down to 1913 numbers. The plant made a lot of effort to make sure that every employee was working to make sure they could put food on the table and take care of their employees.
In order for the company to stay alive, men were employed throughout the winter to remove the overburden, a thick topsoil to expose the limestone beneath. It was cold and brutal work, but the alternative was pulling up stakes and moving away, an option neither the company or the community could afford.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
World War II. Once again, limestone and steel would help forge America's war machines. Roosevelt called it the arsenal of democracy. American GIs were anxious to put the war behind them. They turned to leisure with a fervor not seen since the Roaring '20s. And Calcite employees could enjoy an exclusive retreat just beyond the quarry, Swan Lake.
We had 2 lakes out in the property in Calcite, and I spent many a good hour out there. The fishing was very good, perch and northern pike. I really enjoyed it.
Everybody had their own spot. If you had a deer blind here, it was like your spot of the woods. It was really neat. Yeah.
With the family down at Swan Bay, we take a boat and we water ski in there, and they built a dock down there for us. All the employees really liked that.
America needed steel, and steel needed limestone. It was a formula that continued to bring prosperity to Rogers City throughout the 50s.
There was a concern that there weren't enough boats on the lakes to transfer limestone, iron ore, and coal to the steel plants. So you had a flurry of new construction. The economy continued to expand because there was the Marshall Plan starting in '47 for the rebuilding of Europe.
Then came an ambitious project that would forever change the landscape of the American road.
During the 1950s, under the Eisenhower administration, there was the construction of a highway interstate system. That required limestone for making cement.
In 1954, Michigan launched an ambitious project of her own, a 5-mile span across the Straits of Mackinac, the Mackinac Bridge.
Those 2 towers are resting on tons of concrete and limestone. And there are pictures of some of the vessels, especially the Bradley vessels with the self-unloading booms. They would just tie up, swing the boom out, and unload tons of limestone into the caisson directly from the hulls or the holds of those vessels.
Despite the region's turbulent weather, the bridge finished on time and opened in 1957. A tragic echo of Carl Bradley's death 30 years before, the sinking of the Carl D. Bradley during a Lake Michigan storm devastated the community. It was the first maritime tragedy Calcite had suffered in its 46-year history. Almost all of the 33 victims came from Rogers City.
Nobody would have expected that they were some of the safest boats ever afloat. They had received awards for their safety. Safety was very important at Calcite.
A cruel sequel followed the Bradley sinking. In 1965, the Cedarville went down after colliding with another vessel in the Straits of Mackinac. 10 men died. The post-war boom had come to a tragic end.
When you get into the 60s and especially into the 70s, demand decreases, especially for some of the steel-making companies who were feeling the effects of imported steel coming in and undercutting local homegrown steel. And part of that was also smaller steel companies would take scrap parts and they would melt that down and make steel. They could do it cheaper than some of the large steel companies.
In many respects, the Calcite plant had become a family business as fathers brought their sons to work at the quarry.
My dad started working at Calcite in the early 20s. He got hired for his team of horses. And his first job was hauling the drill stems from one drill to another when they were drilling the holes for blasting the stone.
My dad worked there for 45 years in. I retired in '83, but 30 years in. My son Donald retired, but he had his 30 years in. So we got quite a few years in the Calcite. It was a good place to work too.
By the early 80s, American steel faced a growing crisis. recycled steel and overseas competition forced the closing of mills across the country. In the eyes of Calcite's management, the quarry's labor-intensive railroad system, in operation since 1912, could no longer be sustained.
In later years, in 1984, I think it was, right around there, they eliminated the locomotives because at that time then they could eliminate the track crew and the repair crews for the locomotives, and they went to a truck operation.
Eliminated a lot of jobs. So they left and went elsewhere. Some went down to Texas, some went out west on the oil fields and stuff like that. It just, everybody did what they could to get by, you know. And when they started calling people back, some of those that had good jobs didn't come back.
During the 90s and early 2000s, the Calcite plant changed ownership a number of times. In October of 2007, the Belgian-based Carmeuse Group purchased all quarry operations. The 21st century is a far cry from the steam shovels and horse-drawn wagons of a century ago, but safety has always played an important role.
It is the first thing that we think about, and it's the first thing we talk about in any of our meetings.
Everything was focused on safety with signage. You went so many days without a lost time accident. It was posted at the main gate.
Scientists are finding new ways to use limestone. Even after 100 years, innovation remains the most important ingredient.
In the very early years of Michigan Limestone Chemical Company, there was this waste stone that eventually became known as fines. And it was considered waste. You couldn't do anything with it. Carl D. Bradley began to understand that there must be a way you can use this product. And for the next 10 to 15 years, he found the markets to sell this product.
We were blessed with a good supply of limestone here, good quality.
As we celebrate the 100th anniversary, we should be thinking about celebrating our 200th anniversary.
June 23, 2012, marks the centennial of the largest limestone quarry in the world. A fitting occasion to pay tribute to the generations of men and women who made it happen.
I just wish them well, and I just wish that anybody would have just as good a life as I had. And I never missed a payday in 43 years. But if I keep on going, 29 years I've been retired, and I hope to be retired for 43 years so that I can say I retired as long as I worked.